So again, I would not expect a ratio between these two groups of fatty acids close to a pasture one if the animals were exposed to this confinement situation early on. However, would this work for you? Well, maybe yes, because this protocol of yours may say that you want something below 4%, 4 to 1. So this is way below 4 to 1. It's not the perfect world, but it's not as bad. Again, here we're on a 100% hay. This is very similar. The only problem with this that we had, remember, the finishing was not as good. The water holding capacity was not as good. Maybe it was too lean, extra lean beef, and we couldn't compensate during the pasture finishing phase. We couldn't compensate the 6 months of backgrounding on just alfalfa hay. Are we okay with this?
What's your recommendation?
If I could stay here, I would stay here. This is easier and more reliable. However, some people may not have the choice of a winter forage, green growing winter forage. So I would target for something that is one of these two. I would try to stay away of this energy concentrates if I could, of the starch-based concentrates. And the number one thing to look for there is if I'm offering a concentrate, it should be something that would buffer the rumen. We won't drop the pH in the rumen. So that's hard to find. Where there are some highly digestible fibers or sources of energy that may not drop the pH. In my part of the world, we don't have them available, but in your case, you might.
The rumen pH on grass is normally 7, isn't it?
No, it's not 7. It's between 6.5, 6.5 to 7. It's not 7.
Okay.
It's never 7.
And then you're saying on pasture you can drop the rumen pH?
In pastures, you drop the rumen pH is 6.5 and 7. You could drop it if you are. It's hard to drop it in pastures, but if I offer a supplement, like I said, starch or molasses in a high proportion, I could drop the pH to below 6.5, even to 6, and even sometimes below 6. So we want to be careful with that amount of supplement. And if we drop below 6.5, the activity of this bacteria that we need to create these omega-3s will decline in the rumen.
What number would it be if it's on grain?
If it's on grain 100% or 90%, we will be around 5, 5.5, because the rumen keeps that buffering capacity also working full speed. When the animal gets intoxicated with acidosis in the feed yard, you see the pH dropping below 5 to 4.5, 4.5, 4.8. That's an acidotic syndrome. Lactic acid brings everything to about 4, the lactic acid. And that's why in silos, or when you ensile forages, you're targeting for 4.5 or 4s because of the lactic acid. That's the pH or the pK for lactic acid.
Now, what does feeding silage do to the rumen versus hay?
Okay, we feed the silage in the rumen. First of all, remember that silage is a fermented feed, okay? So silage is never stable. There's fermentation happening. The first things that are fermented are all the sugars. Very quickly, all the sugars available, simple sugars. Then the starches get fermented. If there is no starch, then fermentation starts to working on the most degradable fiber sources, which are the hemicelluloses. And the problem, then we have very low sugars, so simple sugars in any silage. Most likely we're adding water with this silage to the rumen. Silages are often 18, 20, 22% dry matter. You may say, well, that might be enough. But that's enough dry matter when we're talking grass, green growing grass and grazing grass. These silages tend to be washy when they are 20-22% dry matter. Many times they are. So they're not compensating dry matter. Depending on where you get the silage from, if it is a warm season species or a cool season, you may have more or less available nitrogen in that silage. Let's say we're talking alfalfa silage here. We got rid of all the sugars very quickly. Alfalfa may have, or white clover may have 6-7%, 8% sugars in the best case. Most of the time it's 5% sugars, very low in sugars. So fermentation gets rid of all the sugars right away. Then the proteins start to get fermented, and nitrogen gets released. So any of these silages that are rich in protein, they also have high nitrogen content. So you're feeding the silage on a already rich nitrogen containing diet, you're worsening the situation. Okay. So if we want to feed silage, we want to feed the silage into something that has a low nitrogen content. Unless we're talking, I mean, here we're talking pasture silage or alfalfa silage. Where we're talking corn silage, it's a different story. Okay. The story is different. But we're talking the pasture silages. The pasture silages will have also, we're trying to bring with them some off or odd flavors. Some of these volatile compounds of fermentation will actually get absorbed pretty quickly, and they're lipid soluble, so that they end up in the fats. I guess what I'm trying to say is we may have to have a very good reason to rely on silage only to finish a steer or fatten a steer or a heifer. Might want to do that in combination with something else. I don't know if that's answering anything, but and we were going to go back to that on Friday, I think. Okay, let me.
Question: all these numbers were predicated on alfalfa hay.
Yes.
Is it an alfalfa pasture also?
This is alfalfa pasture.
Okay. How do these numbers relate to just strictly grass, no alfalfa? Timothy field or something along those lines? Would they be similar?
They're very, very similar. Yes, when we're talking about the grassy, we say pasture here is an alfalfa fescue mixture,
Okay.
but they're more than 50% alfalfa. They really relate. They're pretty similar. And if you look at the research out of Clemson, that they've done several pastures, it's pretty consistent. You may not see this ratio that's low. Maybe it's going to get to 1.6, but it's going to be below 2 to 1. The omega-6, omega-3, they're pretty consistent. And that's something amazing. We're finding that as long as these pastures are growing pastures and good quality pastures, the numbers are very, very consistent. And we've done now a study that I'm just finishing. We went and compared several winter annuals, triticale, wheat, cereal rye, and alfalfa in separate fields. And the three of them, these three winter annuals, they all look so much alike in these lipid profiles that it's amazing. Alfalfa, yeah, it looks a little slightly different to these three, but not that much different. Let me see if I have something else here that I would like to show. And this study, this was with heavier steers. That other one was the same thing, but with light heifers. This is with heavier steers. What we did here, we pasture backgrounded the animals and then feedlot finished them with linseed oil, with the addition of linseed oil. Linseed oil is an unsaturated source of lipids, and it is suggested that providing this linseed oil, you can actually modify that fatty acid ratio to a higher omega-3, lower omega-6. Pasture here in the middle of the way, and then this is again the backgrounding in confinement, and then pasture finished, like in the previous study that showed. Back fat thickness, these animals were pretty fat. We're targeting always for at least a third of an inch. And here we have more than a half an inch of back fat. We kind of over fatten these steers a little bit. Shear force, very similar. The marbling scores, similar also. And then since we have a similar marbling, we may have similar juiciness. Water holding capacity is pretty much the same. And why this shear force is similar, maybe is because the connective tissue content is similar. And I think for most of you, one of the main challenges is going to be how do you get these animals to produce you meat that is low and consistently low in connective tissue. That is going to be, I think, a target for the future. We've been expending a lot of years and time on marbling and fatness and getting the animals to a minimum level of fatness or back fat, cover fat, and that's great. That gives us the finishing and the looks, and the animals will look nice. But that doesn't tell the whole story. That doesn't tell us if that's going to be tender or not so tender meat. That creates a saleable product, but still the problem with tenderness may be there. And it's more associated to connective tissue, and connective tissue is associated to genetics and management. If we are hard with the animals, they have a harsh, difficult life. If they don't have a luxury life, luxurious life, they may develop more connective tissue. So again, I think it's going to be a balance between fatness and management, handling of these animals through stocker and the finishing phase and the genetics that we have. Yes, sir. Do we have one back there?
Are you saying that there is less connective tissue if it is a low-stress animal?
Yes. If you have the genetics for it. Genetics are associated to connective tissue. I'm not in favor of against the different breeds, but we tend to see within the British breeds lower connective tissue than compared to the Indicus or Brahman crosses. And even within the British breeds, there are some that tend to have develop a little more connective tissue than others. Yes, sir.
Is a frame score, the 3s and 4 animal types, are they have less connective tissue than the
I don't know that. I cannot answer the frame score and connective tissue. What I can say that the 3 and 4s are easier to fatten younger. And the age has to do with connective tissue. So if you get the animal finished within the 2 years of age, 2.5 years of age, then you're likely to hit a low content of connective tissue, low proportion. If you're above 2.5 years of age, closer to 3, maybe you're going to be within the more higher connective tissue content. And also that's associated with the animal's life, because why would you be slaughtering or harvesting an animal that is 3 years old? If it's not genetics related, then there is something during the process from weaning or even before weaning that went very slow. Maybe the animal went through a period of restriction and struggle, and that creates a more connective tissue itself. You see what I'm saying? The age is we call that age, but age is associated with the type of life. If you want to slaughter a steer at 2 years of age, well, that steer would need a nice life. Otherwise, it's not going to get finished and slaughtered at 2 years of age. You see what I'm saying?
Anibal, back in the 50s, when they had the Western grass-fed finished beef, traditionally what would happen while those animals were so old is that they lost most of the weight they gained in the winter that they gained in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a real slow process to get them up to that
Yeah,
final finish.
but that doesn't create tenderness. That creates maybe a little more tougher meat. Why? Because when you're in a no gain, or remember that these are young animals. Like any young individual, the natural tendency is to grow, to develop, grow and develop, okay? If we halt that process, if we stop the growth, that individual is going through some heavy stress. We tolerate that, we call that restriction, and then we say that we compensate that in a feed yard or somewhere else. Here, that stress may show later down the road. And actually, it happens the same thing in the feed, even if you go through a feed yard, a feedlot. In the feedlot, you don't have tender beef all the time. And that sometimes that's related to that period of the struggle and very low gains or weight loss from weaning and even before weaning. So think about ourselves when we are going through a diet or through a weight loss. We are in trouble. I mean, we're tense, we're nervous, we're losing weight is nothing, it's not easy, it's not really something desirable, and creates a stress. And so, and more so in these animals that are growing. We're not talking adults, we're not talking cows that we know that they will lose weight and back, and then they will recuperate that weight. We're talking about growing animals, heifers, steers that are growing. So we stop that growth. It's a tremendous impact on the kind of on the distribution of the body mass, and actually we're preparing that animal to a difficult life. So most likely that connective tissue is going to develop, and actually that animal is also exercising for it because it's searching for food, it's nervous, it's tense, it's exercising, and developing muscle for a more for a difficult situation. Am I making any sense with this? So again, a nice life would be slightly better from this standpoint and the tenderness comments that I was making. Yes, sir.
Is there a relation between how long it's aged? We were talking about that with flavor. Is that also affecting
Okay,
this?
the age that I'm talking about is the chronological age, not the aging of the meat. Okay.
Yeah, but I'm asking if you did age the meat, would that affect it as well as flavor?
Yes, yes, and we will talk a little bit about that. But just to say a few words, the aging the meat in a cooler is a way to tenderize the meat. You know, if you harvest the meat, it's right after harvest, it's very tough. Then it starts to give because of this enzymatic degradation of the muscle. It breaks all the muscle fibers into meat. We create meat. Start creating the meat 3 days after harvest, not really before. Before that, it's all actual muscle. And there are a series of enzymatic reactions and interactions that happen to lose the muscle fibers. And that takes over 21 days, but it happens over 21 days at least. The first 7 days are very relevant during the aging process. That's when we really tenderize the meat. And 7 days are important. 14 days give us a little more homogeneity, more consistency. But the first 7 days, 8 days are the most relevant. Tenderizing the meat, if it was high in connective tissue, it's going to help through the aging. The risk that we run into when we don't have an excessive amount of fat, or let's do it the reverse, when we have a lean beef, lean carcass, is that our off flavors or odd flavors will increase more in these lean carcasses than in a fat, regular carcass. So
Odd flavors?
odd flavors and off flavors, both. Undesirable flavors, rancid type of flavors. Rancidity becomes an issue when we don't have this back cover. I mean this layer of back fat protecting that carcass. And I don't know if you've seen carcasses, grass-fed produced carcasses in the coolers, but you can see everything. You can see from well finished with a good back fat blanket on the outside to nothing that looks red, and blue, like game.